You thought I was done with videos on this device, but we're just getting started. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Joey's Retro Handhelds. I'm Joey, and today we're going to be talking about moving to a full streaming setup, so both local and remote streaming in your house. Just to clarify that point for a lot of people that might get confused, there's local streaming, which has to do with your internal network and has nothing to do with how fast your internet is or anything along those lines. It's basically just how your coverage is within your house, how your access points are set up and router and all of that. Using software like Moonlight is a good example of this, and you would install Moonlight on any device that you'd want to do streaming to. And then you would set up Sunshine on the actual PC, and that would send all the information over to Moonlight so you can play your games. But then you can also extend this further to Xbox and PlayStation, and Xbox uses an app called XB Play, which is a third-party app that can do local streaming for you and even does Xbox 360 games. And then on the other side, there's PlayStation with PS Play, another third-party app, but it also does local play as well. Remote streaming is when you're actually using your internet to stream, and you can actually use Moonlight and PS Play and XB Play to do this, but you might be more familiar with something like Microsoft's xCloud or Boosteroid or GeForce Now. These are all software and platforms that can serve up content remotely and you can access it through your internet. So look, you've followed my channel for a long time now, and you know that I've been trying to find a really good x86 device, which basically just means a Windows or Linux handheld that I can just use forever and does everything that I need. I've tried the Asus ROG Ally, the Steam Deck, the GPD Win 4s, the Aya Neo devices. I've gone down a long road, even the AYN Lokis, and I just haven't been able to find anything that I really like. For me, the Asus ROG Ally comes the closest, and I actually really enjoy that device, but there's a lot of negatives to it that just keeps it from being the perfect device for me specifically. Then the AYN Odin 2 arrived, and now for me, this is going to be my perfect device for everything that I was going to use Windows devices for. The Odin 2's form factor for weight, battery life, processing power, and all of that is exactly what I was looking for in a Windows device, but just isn't going to exist for a few years, I think. Because also, I have a pretty beefy Windows PC, and that can do any game at 1080p 60. So I want to utilize that with an actual device so that I can get the best of both worlds. Local streaming is the answer for me, but of course that's not going to be for everyone. There's a lot that goes into local streaming that may not work for everyone's setup. Also, consider the fact that this is not exactly plug and play. It actually does take some time and effort to set everything up properly. Then let's talk about why this actually works, and at least for me. When I look at a Windows-based handheld like the Asus ROG Ally or even Windows on the Steam Deck, there's a few different negatives that I think a lot of people are aware of. The weight of the handheld, the actual size of it, the battery life, and power too. And I'm going to add power as a caveat here. Look, I was really excited to play a lot of AAA games on my Asus ROG Ally, even my Steam Deck, until I found out that after a while, you kind of get bored of that whole, you know what, this is really cool that we're playing this on here, but I have a PC that can run this a lot better, and I'd rather just play it there. Instead of running something like Starfield at 25 FPS to make it runnable on the device, I can just run it at 1080p 60 and have an actually good time. Because a lot of times you're just setting things to 40 FPS, 40 Hz, 720p, and we're in 2023 and I don't really want to do that anymore. So for me, I think with a really good setup, I can get 1080p, 60 FPS, maxed out graphics in any game that I play, and just stream it. For a lot of people, I think they're not using their handheld devices out on the go. So if 99% of your use case is at home, then this is probably a better option for you, especially if you have an actually good PC just sitting there. These were all of the things that I was thinking about looking at my Asus ROG Ally and just thinking of my actual use cases, because I was just playing on the couch, really next to a power bar all the time and never really going out with it or doing anything with it. So I figured, why don't I just upgrade that experience in a better way since I'm at home anyways? So that's why I'm glad that the AYN Odin 2 arrived, and it actually fit the need of what I wanted. And that just means a device that's lightweight, has a great battery life, can do streaming, but also does a lot of stuff when you're on the go. So you're not losing power there. I can play 4K, GameCube, Wii, PlayStation 2, and all of that. Like, I don't have to make any concessions when it comes to power. I can just do whatever I want. Now, obviously, I can't play Windows games or PC games on the go, but that's just a use case that I won't really have an issue with, because for 99% of what I'm doing, I'm at home and I can just do that while I'm here. And if I'm on the go, I'll just do emulation, and I can split it up that way. Obviously, right now you're like, hey, streaming's existed for years now, and I've been doing it, and I use XYZ device to do it. This goes back to what I was just saying about the power part, because things like the Logitech xCloud exists, Absolute exists, and we have these kind of thin client-like streaming devices, but as soon as you disconnect them from the internet, there isn't much that they can do. And the xCloud can do some GameCube and all of that, but I mean, you're not going to have a really good time. I think that's where the Odin 2 takes it a step further, is because you can actually use it when you're not connected to the internet, and then when you are, just start streaming and you have a really good time here. So that's kind of what I was thinking when I'm looking at the Odin 2 and why it's a different use case than what we've seen before for streaming devices. The question that I haven't answered yet, and that you're probably screaming at the TV or phone, is what about input latency? What about lag? What about all of that sort of thing that gets introduced when you're having to deal with wireless? And this was probably the biggest surprise to me, is that when you actually set up everything properly, and what I mean by that is having your actual computer displaying the same resolution and frame rate as your actual device that you're using, so like my Odin 2, which would be 1080p 60, I don't feel the inherent latency or lag or anything that's supposed to be in there that should make it unplayable for me. You feel a little tiny bit that would be normal for anything, but it's more of a using a Bluetooth controller than anything else. It's not a, hey, I'm waiting 1 second to make a move or that sort of scenario. It's entirely different, and it was probably the most surprising thing to me, and could just be my setup, but it ends up working basically perfectly. Now, when I talk about my setup, my house is wired for Ethernet ports, and I have access points giving me coverage throughout my house, and that's just Wi-Fi 6E right now. So not even the Wi-Fi 7 that the Odin 2 can use. And so a lot of people might not have that same experience. You might be using an older Wi-Fi technology, you might not have coverage, you might have your router hidden in your furnace room, hidden behind it, and barely any coverage. So a lot of people might have different experiences with this sort of setup. But for me, and if you have an actual network setup in your house, I think you should try this out and see if it works for you. Because this might be a better scenario than spending $1,000 on Windows PCs and having to play at 720p and 40 hertz, because that's just not fun. Let's talk a little bit about my setup and what I actually had to do to get it perfect, because out of the box, it's not going to be the best experience completely. You could go ahead and just set the resolutions and frame rates and all of that and see if it works, and it might be a good time, it might not be. But there's little tweaks and things that you need to do to just make the experience better. Those tweaks are wake on LAN, so just remotely waking on the computer so I don't have to go and touch it to actually turn it on. Or things like a dummy HDMI plug, which lets me turn off all of my monitors while I'm playing, so I can conserve power by not having the monitors on. Little things like that that helps make the experience better. Even something like an auto hotkey script, which I have set up, and when I click it, I can have my on-screen display show up so I can see my frame rate and CPU power and all of that sort of thing. And lastly, of course, like any other thing, you're going to need a front end, and so I'm using Playnite for every single thing that I do. So as soon as I click Moonlight and jump right into my computer, Playnite pops right up and I can just select a game and off I go. It acts basically as you would expect a Windows device to act, except you're not on an actual Windows device. So that's my setup, and there's a lot that I could go into, and I might do an actual guide that just shows it all. Let's talk about the other streaming setups that you could do if you don't have an actual computer at home. The second best service that I found, besides Moonlight and using your own computer, is GeForce Now. And that's a remote streaming setup that you don't need your actual computer for. It also has the best input lag and network latency out of any other remote streaming service that I've tried. It's really good on that front. Now, the negatives are you have to actually own all of your games through different platforms, so like Steam, Epic, and all of that. However, on top of that, it doesn't support every single game out there, so it's only a limited number of games that you can actually stream from. Plus, it was a bit expensive, and I think it was around $20 a month or something along those lines. So for me, it wasn't actually a need that I needed to solve because I have a home PC and I can just use that. But it might be a good option if you don't. And then, of course, next up would be Microsoft's xCloud. And this is probably the worst remote streaming service that I've used. Actual latency is an issue, the actual image clarity is an issue, the actual service is just not great. But you can actually play Game Pass games on it. And if you don't have a home computer, then it is an option. After using Better xCloud and the Kiwi browser and even the xCloud app and trying all different apps, never found a good way to actually play xCloud, even with a good internet setup. However, using XB Play locally, I can play Xbox 360 games off of my Xbox One S, and so I've been able to play games like Lost Odyssey really well on my local internet. So it's a bit of a different scenario because you're not using xCloud or remote streaming. So you can sort of see when it comes to just local streaming, and I can play all of my PlayStation 5 games, my Xbox games, my PC games, everything just on a lightweight Odin 2. It's a really, really good option for a lot of people, including myself. But let's talk about who this isn't for, because this is a very niche case. You need to have a really good PC setup unless you're going to do remote streaming. But on top of that, you have to have an actual good network setup. So something that's covering most of your entire house, or at least where you'll be normally sitting. So I think if you don't have a PC that's connected by Ethernet to an Ethernet drop or your router directly, and you don't have an access point that's really meant for a house or a larger kind of setup, then this might not be the right setup for you. And also if you're maybe not at home a lot. So if you're actually using your remote device, then this might not be the best option for you. Plus, probably the fact that this isn't completely plug and play and does take some setup and tweaking on your end. So maybe the non-technical related people out there might not have a good time here. But I think for the rest of you that are probably using a really good PC and all of that, then maybe try this. And if there's any interest in seeing the actual guide or how my setup actually works, then let me know and I'll show you. But like I said, it's basically a combination of different scripts and things like that that just have my setup perfect. So wake on LAN to wake on the computer, setting up Moonlight to auto boot into Play Night, having an on-screen display sometimes when I want it depending, and having my resolution and frame rate on my computer set up to automatically match the device that's connecting to it. Plus just turning off the monitors so I can conserve power and not have everything on. But for me, I'm completely converting over to this, and it's been 3 or 4 weeks now that I've been doing so. I don't think I'll ever go back, and I'm probably going to be selling my Ally pretty shortly, as I'm not going to find a need for it anymore. That's going to be it for this one. Let me know in the comments below, did I maybe pique your interest in trying out Moonlight or a setup like this? And remember, it's not something you can just jump right in, you have to actually set it up properly, or you're just going to have a bad time. Don't forget to like and sub to help the channel grow, and hope you all have a good one.